What's your minimum specification?
There are 4 things that every consumer wants out of their processor: super low price, super high frequency, lots of cores, and perhaps the ability for it to be unlocked. Now, through 2011 to 2017, 2018, the king of the hill for the mainstream was the quad core. At the beginning, we'd take them to around, say, 4 gigahertz, and over time that pushed up to nearer 5 gigahertz. And if you decided to go for the Extreme platform, you could get 6 cores, then 8 cores, then 10 cores, and overclock them if you can deal with the heat. Now, back in the day, processors weren't bins near their frequency wall. Back then, you could get an E6400, say, and you could go from 2.13 gigahertz all the way up to 3.2 gigahertz and get that 50% overclock. Same with the Core i7-920. If you wanted more cores and more performance back then, you had items like the EVGA SR2, which could take 2 6 or 8 core Xeon chips, and you could overclock those. And this was a really fun platform for people who did sub-zero overclocking. The thing is, at the time, and even still today, Intel has high core count server processors that go way beyond what the consumer market or the high-end desktop market can provide. Intel has historically, in that Xeon market, had 3 different types of silicon. You have low core count, which, the 6 to the 8 cores. You have what they're called high core count, or sometimes medium core count. And then you have the extreme core count. And this is where we get numbers like the 15, the 18, eventually the 28 cores from. So if we go through the timeline, starting with Sandy Bridge E, here's an E5 2600. And this has 8 cores, so eventually launched 10 core parts, while in the high-end desktop space we had 6. For Ivy Bridge, we have this 12 core, and eventually we had 15 cores at the super high 8 socket end. And all this time, the consumer market, again, had 6 cores. Next generation of Xeons for the Haswells, they had 14 to 18 core parts, while we only had 8 cores at the time. Broadwell extended that to 20 to 24 cores, while again, we only got 10 cores on the high-end desktop. And then, most recently, the Skylake Xeons and the Cascade Lake Xeons, they went up to 28 cores. And initially, Intel only served us 10 cores, again, on the high-end desktop. So all the way through this, the high-end desktop users, the prosumers, and the extreme overclockers were all trying to get Intel to launch their top-end high-core count silicon, but unlocked for the general consumer. The thing is, Intel unofficially kept saying no. They didn't want their most expensive chips being sold in a consumer-like product, lest it usurp some of their sales. They also didn't think that the motherboards could support such a high core count, such a high frequency, all these chips going perhaps near to 4 to 5 or under sub-zero to 6 gigahertz. And there's ultimately the question of price. How do you price a chip like this? If you price it more like a consumer part, then you're undercutting yourself on the Xeons. However, if you price it too high, then you're only going to get prosumers and extreme overclockers buying it. And extreme overclockers, if they break it, they'll try and RMA it. So are you actually making money at the end of the day by creating this sort of platform? So there were lots of arguments, especially in the extreme overclocking community, which I was a part of. There was one ray of hope, and that was ex-Intel performance engineer Francois Pierre-Noël. At the time, he was a member of these overclocking forums, and he saw, all the comments, and he would sometimes, make mention of, people are talking about it inside the company. At one point, he even ran a poll on Twitter, asking people whether they wanted a chip with all the cores, but fully unlocked, just so he could show some numbers internally to find if, this would actually be viable and there's actually a market for it. Now, at the time, nothing transpired. Intel was still happily funding overclocking competitions. I went to a few as press. They were quite happy to have their mainstream parts overclocked, but in no way were they interested in having their high core count Xeons overclocked. Then AMD came along. We saw with Ryzen, first with unlocked 8 cores on the desktop, then unlocked 16 cores with Threadripper. Intel had to respond. Now, you could argue that a product like this needed more time than Intel took to launch the chip to actually get it ready. But they very quickly came out with 18 cores unlocked, and we saw the whole price of the market shift quite a bit. Then AMD went and launched their 32-core Threadripper, second generation Threadripper 2990WX. 32 cores, unlocked. Yeah, sure, it had a slightly odd configuration that made latency and memory a little bit weird. But hey, for the chip that it was a really interesting product for the market and for overclockers just to play with AMD's Zen architecture. So Intel, throughout all of this, finally launched this. This is the Xeon W3175X. This is 28 cores, fully unlocked. This has a 3.1 GHz base, 4.3 GHz turbo, 6 channels of DDR4, 48 PCIe 3 lanes. It's the LGA 3647 socket, and we'll go into that in a bit. This was announced late through 2018, and a formally announced 2018 came to the market in 2019 for $3,000. Yeah, and we can see for 28 core, this was Intel at Computex. They showed this as, brand new Intel 28 core for consumers, of prosumers, and they showed it all running every core at 5 gigahertz. Intel didn't say at the time that it was overclocked, didn't say on stage. And we found out from the motherboard manufacturers later that day that the system was actually using a water chiller to keep it cool. Now, I remember crisscrossing Taipei at 8 a.m. the next morning to rush to Gigabyte Suite, actually, to take pictures of the system. This caused a lot of uproar. Intel didn't say it was overclocked yet. It was overclocked, and the pictures weren't exactly great. Showing water chiller hoses, and it was all rather odd. So at the time, Asus and Gigabyte both had motherboards on display. This is the Asus model. This is the ROG Dominus Extreme. We'll come back to that in a second. And here's the Gigabyte system that they actually used to do a demonstration, the 5 gigahertz demonstration. As you can see, there's a water pump. The water pipes are all lagged. And there's plenty of paper around to make sure that there are no leaks and no condensation because they were using a water chiller. And here's the water chiller with one of the boards exposed and the 32 phases. This water chiller had a cooling capacity of anywhere from 750 watts plus. So after we saw this later in the day, Intel actually invited me and a few other press, to a small drink session, to a bar to chat with an Intel spokesperson, somebody who I'd never met before. We were told that in the script for the presentation that Greg Bryant on stage, Intel's VP, was actually meant to say overclocked. They'd actually told us that they practiced the whole speech twice, and that both times he had mentioned overclocked. So it was odd that he didn't mention it when it was actually live. But then if, our argument was, well, if you wanted to make sure that everybody knew it was overclocked, then perhaps the screen behind it should have said 28 core overclocked to 5 gigahertz, that sort of thing. I want to read this next bit word for word in my script here because it's pretty important. The Intel spokesperson went into a rant about how the media didn't ask if the system was overclocked before publishing. Basically, he's saying, well, why didn't we ask that it was overclocked before we published? Now, bearing in mind that this is a live press event, so obviously things are being typed up as they're being announced. He accused the media, me and other, Tom's Hardware, those sorts of people, of actually being disingenuous because we didn't ask whether it was overclocked. Now, needless to say, I went into a tirade with a spokesperson about how the media worked. So, for example, we didn't wait to hear how much L3 cache it had, for example. We didn't wait to hear, what the turbo power was or the sustained time for turbo was. These are all things that you can find out after the fact, and it shouldn't be relevant to the story. Now, if the system, if they'd have mentioned it was overclocked on stage, we'd have known straight away. So I mean, a few people, published saying, this is clearly overclocked, and they were looking at pictures, and that's why the next morning we went out to, say, Gigabyte. I don't know, Linus at the time went to go see Asus and actually look at the systems that were being displayed. So, yeah, I went in tirade with this spokesperson about how the media worked, and I've only ever seen that spokesperson once before since, and this is one argument that I vividly remember because it's one of the worst arguments I've had since being in this industry. I was visibly shaking at the end of it, so much so that I had to, pull my Intel contact aside later in the day and say, look, being sent to a meeting and being called disingenuous was, yeah, that's an odd thing. This guy was clearly not PR trained. And like I said, I've seen him once since. And time moves on. And everybody was, still relatively interested, fully unlocked Intel 28-core processor. It's a new thing. And to the point where this wouldn't go in any normal LGA 3647 motherboards. We saw the Gigabyte and the Asus motherboard that needed to be specially built. These both have, best parts 32 phases and special cooling, and they're way larger than, EATX standard. So like I said, this is the ROG Dominus Extreme, and the Gigabyte one is called the C621 Aorus Extreme. Now, we were told at the time by some senior people that between Intel and the two motherboard vendors, they're expecting about 1,500 units or so total, which meant that it was a very lopsided development between how much R&D had to go into this product versus how many were sold. And I think one of the motherboard vendors at the time said, "Oh, we're only planning to make 500 boards, and we expect the other guys to pick up the rest." So it was something like that. Asus's motherboard, we were told at the time actually that it was meant to only be sold to system integrators only. Like people building pre-builts that you could buy. But in the end, Asus sold it, direct to end users for, was it $1,500, $1,800? And Gigabyte's model took a few months later, but, the chip on top of that was another $3,000 at retail. Intel eventually showed, system working under normal cooling at their fall PC Fall event later in the year. That's when they did, the sort of official announcement before it came out, CES 2019. So as part of my day job, as many of you probably know, I'm senior CPU editor for AnandTech, and this YouTube channel is, kind of my thing that I do for stuff that isn't necessarily on AnandTech. But, here's a system that they sent us to review, and my Berman cat Summer, who was being very loud the day it came. This case is massive. This is an Anades Crystal XL case. It is massive. It is super heavy. Both sides of the chassis are tempered glass. It's a heck of a board to move, and this is what it looked inside. So Intel sampled these systems to about 15 to 20 press, I think, focusing mainly on the press that can do the test for prosumers, do the tests for workstation users, because ultimately this is the sort of system that it was aimed for. So we got the chip. We understand that most reviewers at the time got the Asus board because that was the one that was done. We learned that a few reviewers later got ones with the Gigabyte board. So we have super large case. We've got a Gigabyte GTX 1080 inside. They somehow didn't go for an Asus 1080. I don't know why that was. Inside is EVGA 1600 watt power supply, 480 gig UART2 Optane drive. We've got 6 sticks of memory in there. Lots of cooling. Intel actually supplied a second CPU cooler in case this one didn't work so well. And it was quite fun. And at the minute, I have the same system, in the office. I've actually got it just down there. If you can hear the fans run, I'm sorry. I've currently got 768 gig of memory in there, and it's working on a mathematical constants project, and it has been working on it for about 3 months now, constantly. I have got a video planned on what that's doing. But yeah, I took out the W3175X and put the Xeon 8180 in because the 3175X wouldn't take my LR DIMMs. So it's a project that needs a lot of memory. But ultimately, this is a retrospective on this 28-core chip. And was it what we'd expected? Was it what the overclockers had expected? Because this is a chip that would ultimately, if somebody wanted a 28-core Intel single socket system, they weren't going to buy a Xeon anymore. Maybe if they didn't need LR DIMMs, they would buy this chip. And so when we reviewed it at the time, we compared it against the 16-core Threadrippers, the 32-core Threadrippers, and Intel's own 28-core chips. And in general, this $3,000 chip had the edge because it was competing against Zen and Zen Plus at the time. So it had an IPC advantage. It also had a frequency advantage because it was, Intel's high performance 14 nanometer. And except for a few edge cases where AMD's 32 core and the memory configuration and the extra latency that the 2990WX had at the time, that had the edge in very few benchmarks. But overall, the 3175X was still the better CPU. The problem was that this CPU, $3,000. The motherboard, $1,500. Some strong cooling could come at $500. So there's $5,000 before you've thought about memory, storage, case, power supply. AMD's 32 core or the 16 core, which is actually what we recommended out of the Threadrippers at the time. You could buy the 32 core for $1,800 and then a motherboard for $500. So instantly, you're spending half as much and you're getting, almost, but not quite performance. Now, the thing is, now to quote Francois Pierre-Noël, the Intel engineer, the ex-engineer that I mentioned earlier, he is strong with the belief that there's a segment of the market that wants the best performance chip regardless of the price. And he's right. For a lot of people, getting that, extra 5, 10, 15% performance or more in some cases, spending double for it, yeah, they'll happily do that because they can amortize it. For most of the people, though, perhaps maybe not so much. And then AMD came out with the 32-core Threadripper 3000 and the 64-core Threadripper 3000, which completely blows this away. I will say as well that 255 watts TDP for this chip, for this Xeon 3175X. We were able to get it, at 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz when overclocked on the cooling that Intel sent us, but it was pulling over 600 watts CPU alone. This thing is a power-hungry beast. Now, what about overclocking? Now, I mentioned earlier that Extreme Overclocking, these are the guys who wanted the multi-core unlocked chips. They wanted to be able to take 10, 12, 15, 18, 22, 24, 28 cores, all the way to 5 gigahertz and beyond. The problem is, because Intel had only done this as a result of, you could argue it was as a result of AMD's offerings into the market, is the reason why they hadn't done it before. The Extreme Overclockers were used to, extreme cooling 4 cores and 6 cores and 8 cores. And then they had some experience with the 18 cores that had come slightly previously, but now you're giving them 28 really hot cores and massive motherboard with 32 phases and a CPU that could start pulling 1,000, 1,200 watts under extreme cooling. So was it a good CPU for them? So for that, I've actually turned to a good friend, Joseph Stepongzi, who you may know as through his Bearded Hardware YouTube channel. He is the Tech Odin, and I asked him a few questions about what his experience was with this chip. So again, thanks Joe for joining me. Joe is Bearded Hardware, Tech Odin, where Steve is Tech Jesus. We have Joe is Tech Odin. Thanks for joining me. I wanted to talk to you about the W3175X and the 28-core Intel chip. I mean, you've overclocked this thing. What on Sub-Zero? What's it like?
It's a pain in the butt. I mean, it's a monster chip. Like the die is, like, I have huge hands, by the way. I don't know if it comes through in here, but like the die is monstrous. I know you have one in front of you, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Like seriously, like I feel like you throw that at somebody, they're gonna get hurt. But yeah, it's quite a beast, I guess you can say. All the power that it pulls, I think it's pushing like anywhere from 13 to 1400 watts, like fully up there. Say
Oh
like
wow.
5.6, say like 5.6 Cinebench, R15, something like that. So if you have a good chip,
So and it's
highly.
it's different to how you would overclock the quad cores.
Yeah, it's the whole high performance desktop, which is the HPDT, something like that. I always mess that one up. I just call it HIPPID. But I just say high performance desktop. But yeah, they have this thing called Fibra. You know,
Fiverr,
it's
yeah.
yeah, it's basically so that maintains it. It's basically I guess where they put they have one voltage that goes into the chip and all the voltage regulations inside the chip. From a liquid nitrogen standpoint, it's kind of more of a pain than it's worth. It basically creates a thing called what we call a cold bug. So in the case with say like a 99, you could take a 9900K all the way down to minus 900 or minus 196 degrees Celsius. With these, anything that has that fibra thing, basically will only go to anywhere from like minus 100 to minus 120 if you finagle it a little bit. So it's it's quite a beast to try to tame the power. You need a really big pot, really fast, big like pot. You can't use. You have to be very specific with it. It's very hard to mount correctly because just the way the socket is it's in itself. The 3647 socket is. I don't know. The whole mounting mechanism is a flat out pain.
It's one of these systems you need two or three people kind of assisting you at the same time, making sure everybody's keeping notice of the temperature and the operating system, keeping
Oh,
it stable.
well, there's a lot of parts of it. I mean, you got what is that? They call it not quad channel. They have hectachannel
Hexachannel,
or
yeah.
hexachannel. Yeah, that's it. So you're figuring six modules that go to the CPU. One of the biggest issues that you have is I know I've showed it on one of my videos. I was kind of just making a spoof on it with the AMD stuff. To be honest, I like the Threadripper mounting mechanism way better. But on the Intel one, you basically there's no mounting mechanism, right? You're basically using the cooler as the mounting mechanism.
Yep.
So you have to get around that by I guess Asus made it like a whole bracket that you can have that will actually put it so that way the chip doesn't move. The problem with that is if you don't get that exactly right, it's kind of like Threadripper. If you don't do it mounted correctly, you'll lose a bunch of channels.
Yep.
So you could be getting like 4 channels, 3 channels, and it drives you nuts. You got to get the right pressure down, and trying to do that with a liquid nitrogen pot, and then trying to not get the memory cold, and you're just doing so much. It's a royal pain in the you know what.
So with these motherboards, I mean, I've got the Asus, you've got the Gigabyte, and I know EVGA have one out now. Is there anything special on these motherboards to do with overclocking, or do you have to take any extra preparation for these because these boards are so massive and have 32 phases?
Um, well, we have to insulate. There's a lot of insulation to go around. I mean, you have to be careful between the CPU and the memory. Um, Memory, just because BDI is basically one of the most popular now. It's the highest performance memory you can get. It has cold issues. So one of the problems we have is that the cold basically goes down from the pot into the side channels. So it causes a bunch of issues there. From an overclocking perspective, there's really not any like cheap boards. I think if you go with all three of them, you're pretty much can do pretty much as long as you want. Um, I think the main problem is probably maybe finding BIOS issues.
Do you think Intel launching this 28 core chip was a good idea?
Um,
Because
I
we've
don't
been
know. I
after it
think
for a while, right?
well, it's kind of. I think at the time when you can't even say it's when they released it though, because it's 2 years ago, or it's got to be what almost two.
A year
So it
and a bit.
wasn't last Computex; it was the Computex before.
Yep.
So that's 2 years ago that they introduced this 28 core, and I mean at the time it was like, oh wow, a 28 core, that's crazy. You can overclock it. I think at that time, I thought it was cool, but it's kind of as more as we've gone, it's kind of become almost pointless. Like, I mean, the space alone was too niche. It's way too expensive. Um, Now, obviously, that AMD came out with Threadripper, it makes it even more pointless because now 28 cores, you can get a 32 core for pretty much almost half the price, right? And then you can also get a 64 core if you want, and then you got PCIe lanes like crazy depending on what board you get for Threadripper. So, but again, Threadripper just came out, so I was expecting to see Intel come out with something maybe like how they come out with 14 plus 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 plus. I was hoping for a 28. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think that would have been more interesting, and then maybe if they dropped the price, and then it would be more viable. I think at the time it was something that was definitely really cool to um, look at or play with if you had it. I didn't get it until probably the year after, maybe, but yeah.
Do you think Intel's going to keep launching these high core count overclockable CPUs?
Um, Possibly. To be honest, this is all obviously speculative, right? So I don't know if there's going to be anything particular. Just saying to put that out there. I don't want anybody to take my words for. I would see them probably coming out with something they have to counter in some way or another. I think one of their biggest hold downs now is that you're on 14 nanometer, right?
Yeah.
So you need something that's going to use less power. I mean, it's nice to see that we have these motherboards that can handle all that crazy power, but when it comes down to it, is that using all that power, it gets expensive, right? You got to throw all that energy through something. So I think Intel really needs to concentrate more on power more than anything right now before they would even consider doing that. And who knows, by going down from 14 nanometer to something like 10 nanometer, how is that going to affect performance? We don't know if it's still going to be power hungry. I mean, there's so many variables and what ifs that who knows, right?
Yeah.
I would, from my perspective, I would love to see something, because usually when Intel is releasing something, it's a little bit more mature. Usually, obviously, they go through like 20 different revisions, right?
Yeah.
So it matures. It has some good maturity, but it would be nice to see something from them. But I'm kind of not holding my breath at this point.
So, for this retrospective, was the W3175X a good idea for Intel? In my opinion, it was a chip that Intel had to launch, though it wasn't as successful as it could have been. For a number of reasons. It took Intel several generations and the threat of a competitor to launch it. The Extreme Overclockers may have liked it more if they'd had practice to it. Having this expensive chip back then, off asking for 1,000, 2,000 for the unlocked 15 core would have been palatable. But the overclocking the whole overclocking scene has changed now. Most of the professional overclockers are actually tied to one of the motherboard vendors. So the fact that only Asus and Gigabyte have boards for this, and now EVGA has their respective board, means that MSI and ASRock Extreme Overclockers aren't using it. The casual overclockers market, $3,000 for a chip that could potentially vary in performance. They're not going to shell out for that. These are people who will buy 50 processors and then bin them to find the one that has the best performance under liquid nitrogen and then sell the rest. Can you do that with a $3,000 CPU? No. On the positive side, we asked for an all-core Extreme unlocked processor, and Intel did deliver eventually. So will Intel launch another all-core unlocked CPU? I'm going to say yes, though perhaps not for the reasons you think. So when we overclock this W3175X, and when we look at AMD's 64-core 3990, we are seeing chips where each core is individually binned for a frequency and for a power. AMD's chip, for example, is hitting 280 watts. And most prosumers and end users aren't going to go beyond that. And when we try overclocking all core, because some of those cores are binned quite aggressively, we're not actually getting much beyond that, if anything, especially in the air and water space. You know, if you're lucky and you get a good chip and you set the motherboard just right, you know, you're playing on the limits of overclockability and stability, and it depends what's right for you. The thing is, at this end of the market, the fact that a chip is locked or unlocked doesn't really add any value. So you leave it unlocked and you take it that some users are going to burn their chips and therefore they're going to have to buy another one because technically these companies don't accept RMAs if you've burnt out your overclocked chips. For the select few who can extreme overclock, yeah, do it. Great, that's fine. Intel's got the data now, whether the W3175X has taken away any of that Xeon market, any of that traditional Xeon scalable market. AMD's had that data for a while, and to be honest, they're still selling Epics, hand over fist. AMD is still, Intel is still selling Xeon scalable, hand over fist. So yes, Intel will launch another unlocked all-core chip. Yeah, whether that's 28-core Cascade Lake, or whether it'll be in a future platform, 32 cores or 36 cores, or whatever you want to believe the leaks onto what Ice Lake's server is going to be. Yeah, but I don't think the unlocked part will be the big draw of that chip. Thanks to everybody for watching TechTechPotato. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And thanks to Bearded Hardware for joining us today. Thank you.